Hello and welcome to video 3 of the Building Resilience for Lake Organization series, Cross-Scale Linkages. I'm Chelsea Neiman. Lakes don't exist in isolation. They're a piece of a larger landscape and are connected both ecologically and socially, which means that processes that occur in these systems can happen at a variety of different scales. And why this is important is that not considering scale is one of the most common reasons for failure in natural systems management. And so we have to consider the interactions and processes that influence the system and occur at all different scales. So we have to think about our lake as a piece of the landscape, as a piece of the larger social ecological system in which it resides. So when we think about scale from an ecological perspective, we think about the lake, which is within a watershed, which is on the landscape, which is in our region, which in our case is the upper Midwest. We also have to think about the social scale at which a lot of these processes occur. And that sometimes is a little bit different. So thinking about the lake, which is in the county, which is in the state, which is in the nation. And there's some overlap. So there are things like watershed councils that are management entities that exist on that ecological scale. So it's not always clear cut, but we do really need to think about both the social and ecological scales at which a lot of these processes happen. And so just to walk through an example of how scale matters, we can think about something like fish habitat. So how does scale influence fish habitat? So within our individual lake, fish habitat is really mediated by habitat availability. So for us, that looks a lot like coarse woody habitat. So is there that necessary nursery area for fish to seek refuge? So do we have some fallen trees? Do we have jetties? Do we have coarse woody habitat that provides space for these fish to persist within our individual lake? When we scale up, we think on a watershed level, we could think about something like connectivity. So our lake may be hydrologically connected to another lake, and that can mean that there's a lot of genetic and fish transfer between those two systems. So if you look at this map on the right, we see that all of the green areas are lakes that are connected, and all of the purple areas are lakes that are individual. So in this is the Northeast and Midwest. But this shows like a lot of systems are connected to each other hydrologically, and that means there's a lot of transfer of biological organisms. So things like invasive species can move across here, it can really impact fish habitat. And so thinking about connectivity on a watershed level, you have to think about these important connections between our lake and the lakes next door. And then on a regional level, we can think about something like climate. So fish have a thermal optima. They have a temperature that they need in order to persist. And things like climate change can impact how those fish are distributed across the landscape. So something like a cool water species like a cisco isn't going to do great in Florida. And this is something that really impacts that thermal habitat that fish require. And in order to, we have a tool, the MGLP Conservation Planner, can give us a good idea of what species are likely to persist in our systems in the future. So if you haven't checked out that tool, I highly recommend it. Fish habitat isn't just impacted by the ecological systems, though. We also have to think about the social institutions that are impacting fish habitat across these different scales. So when we ask that same question, how does scale influence fish habitat, we can think about this in the social systems way. So something like on our lake, building up natural shorelines, us building up that coarse woody habitat can really influence how much habitat is available to fish in our lake. When we look more at a state level, we can think about other programs and institutions. So in Wisconsin, the Stream Bank Protection Plan is actually a state level plan that protects the bank of streams, protects fish habitat. And then on a national level, something like the Clean Water Act, which is federal legislation that protects our inland waters. And so when we think about fish habitat on a social side, it's a little bit less obvious what's going on, but there are all of these different things that are occurring at different scales. So why do we care about scale? So slow variables like climate change, slow variables like the Clean Water Act, those are both things that are at really big scales and maybe not something that we're thinking about in our day-to-day operations, but maybe something we should start incorporating into long-term management plans. We also care because insight into these larger scale processes that we don't often think about will really give us an idea of how we can think about managing our lake. Should we focus on adaptation to small scale changes, or should we be thinking more about transformations that are likely to occur at that larger scale? So some key concepts from this video: lakes don't exist in isolation. They exist as a piece across the social ecological system. And that a lot of processes that are occurring in our lake system, in our lake social ecological system, are also occurring at multiple scales. So things happening to us are also happening to our watershed. And the last key concept is that these slow variables tend to happen, but not always, at these larger scales. And so not considering these large scale processes can result in a system in an undesired state. Thank you for tuning into this video. Stay tuned for the last video in the Building Resilience series, Systems Thinking.